Today I'm going to demonstrate how to change the timing belt on a 1.8 turbo engine. This engine is actually out of a 2002 Volkswagen GTI, but is common to other Volkswagens and Audi models. In this case, I have the engine out of the car so you can see the procedure better, but you should be able to change the belt with the engine in the car. The problem I've had in the past is getting the old belt off and the new belt on. It is really tight and seems almost too small to fit, so I have some suggestions on how to make the change easier. It is recommended when changing the timing belt that you also change the water pump, tensioner, and idler pulley at the same time. You can buy everything in a kit. The first thing we need to do is to make sure the timing marks are lined up on the crankshaft and on the camshaft. I've applied some paint to the timing marks just to make them easier to see. Once the marks are lined up, we need to be careful not to turn the engine. Now we take off the belt pulley. I normally just hold the crankshaft from turning, then loosen the bolts, holding the pulley. Finish taking off the bolts, and the pulley will come right off. Next, we take off the cover. I've already done this, but the first thing I do after taking off the cover is to put a mark on one of the teeth of the sprocket and then on the block so I know where the timing marks are without having to put everything back together. The other suggestion I have, which is really helpful, is while the timing belt is still on, put some marks on the belt. I take a little bit of paint and put a mark on the sprocket and on the belt. Then I put a corresponding mark on the belt at the camshaft timing mark. You can transfer these marks to the new belt and then you'll know exactly how to put it back on. I find this very useful. Okay, so now we need to remove the belt. I've already put the stud in the tensioner, but the book calls for a 5 by 55 millimeter stud and then some washers and a nut to compress the piston. The idea is to compress the piston and then put a pin in this hole to hold the piston compressed. You can use a drill bit, or this is a new tensioner, so I have the pin from the factory. After I get it compressed, I can put the pin in the hole. I have noticed that sometimes the piston is rotated so the pin won't go in. In this case, you will have to rotate the piston for the holes to line up. I know the book doesn't call for this, but what I found to be the very easiest thing to do is to actually remove the whole tensioner assembly. This allows you to easily take off the old belt and put on the new belt, getting everything lined up, and then reinstalling the tensioner assembly. If you are replacing the tensioner, as recommended, you'll be doing this anyway. So now I have the piston pinned. I back off the nut to remove the tensioner. There are two bolts holding it on, one right here and one down at the bottom. This allows for easy removal and installation of a new belt. I found it really hard to get the old belt off and almost impossible to put a new belt on with the tensioner installed. It just seemed too small, but in fact it isn't. I'll demonstrate both taking off the old belt and transferring the marks to the new belt, and then just putting on a new belt with no marks. So I need to back off the nut a little bit more to remove the tensioner. This allows the pulley to swing down and loosens the belt quite a bit. You can see that the belt comes off very easily now. You transfer the marks to the new belt. This is a good time to replace the water pump and idler pulley as recommended when changing the timing belt. You should also replace the tensioner, but don't install it at this time. This is the new belt with the marks transferred to it. Put it around the lower sprocket and line up the marks. You can then proceed to put the belt on. you will notice that you can't quite stretch the belt enough to line up the mark at the camshaft. So the thing to do is to back off the crankshaft a little bit to get the belt at the right mark at the camshaft, and then finish putting on the belt. Now return the crankshaft to the timing mark, which will tension the right side of the belt. If you turn the crank any more, it would start turning the camshaft. You can then proceed to put the tensioner back on. But let me back up and demonstrate putting on a belt with no marks. So we proceed to take off this belt and start with a whole new belt with no marks on it. The timing marks are still lined up, which is extremely important. Put the belt around the lower sprocket. Then around the water pump and up to the camshaft. I put a mark on the belt at the lower sprocket just in case the belt slips during installation. This way I have a reference and know where the belt belongs. Just like before, you can't quite stretch the belt, so you back off the crankshaft a little bit and get the belt set. And then go forward and see that the belt is now tensioned on the right side. If you turn it any more, it would start turning the camshaft. I'm actually having a little trouble with the belt slipping, so I'm having to redo this a couple of times. This is why it pays to have the mark on the belt. When you have the belt in the right place, hold a little tension on the pulley and then tighten the belt by putting the crankshaft back on the timing mark. Now you see that the belt is on the right hand side is tensioned and it's exactly in the right place. So now put a mark on the belt adjacent to the camshaft timing mark. These marks are just for reference in case the belt slips or comes off, so you know where to put the belt back. The right side is tensioned, so we now just need to put the tensioner on. I found it easiest to tie up the idler pulley with a piece of wire. It doesn't need to be tight, just tied up. This will make it easier to install the tensioner. I also found it easiest when installing the tensioner to put the bottom bolt in first. You may have to back off the compression stud to get the tensioner back on. Once you have the bottom bolt started, then you can start the other bolt. There will be a little tension, but you will be able to start the bolt easily. As I said, there will be a little tension at this roller. Then you can tighten both bolts. You can now remove the wire holding up the idler pulley. Adjust the compression stud. Put the washers and nut back on and tighten the nut to allow the pin to be removed. Now that the pin is out, back off the nut. I just lift up on the idler pulley to make sure the piston is free, and now the belt is taut on both sides and the timing marks are all lined up. I notice this mark is backed off just a little bit, and so I'll just make it right. Now they are all lined up correctly. You can now take out the stud, and with everything set correctly, it is time to put the cover back on. And then the pulley is reinstalled. There is really only one way to put the pulley on, so you can't get it wrong. There's a little knob right here that goes in a hole on the pulley. You may want to hold the crankshaft so it doesn't turn as you tighten the bolts holding the pulley. Check that the timing marks are all lined up at both the crankshaft and the camshaft. The next procedure calls for the crank to be rotated clockwise 2 turns. Following the turns, again check that the timing marks are still all lined up. The marks we put on the belt are just for initial installation. Once the engine is turned, the marks on the belt will no longer line up, but that's okay. It is the timing marks that are important. That's the easiest way I know to change the timing belt on a 1.8 turbo engine. I hope this helps with your project. Thanks for watching.